Hi, I'm Katrina McLaren, and this is my podcast, The Last Resort. In this series, I'll be talking about our journey and the restoration of Casa Nova House, a stately heritage-listed mansion built in 1861, located in the small town of Oamaru in the South Island of New Zealand. This is a story of how we changed our entire lives, trusted our gut, and took a leap of faith to live our dream. Welcome to the Last Resort podcast. I'm your host, Katrina McLaren, and today we're luckily joined by the wonderful Sarah Gallagher, who's the area manager for Otago and Southland for Heritage New Zealand. Hello, Sarah. How are you?
Tēnā koe. Thanks for having me. How's it going?
Absolute pleasure to have you. It's going fantastically. I've invited you along today to join me on the podcast because obviously we've been doing a series of episodes about Casa Nova House and Brenda and Mai's journey to come to Casa Nova House, how that all came about. And I've just started touching on in the episodes our involvement with Heritage New Zealand and the fact that you guys reached out, you wanted to list Casa Nova House, and we agreed to do that as well. We thought it was the right move for it to be voluntarily listed. But also a little bit more detail, I wanted to share with our listeners why it's important to do that, what our thoughts were around our restoration and how we've managed to do that within its existing floor plan without making any sort of structural changes or anything to the property. So I thought it would be great to come along and have you here with us today so we could go over Casa Nova House and perhaps its significance to the local area. So how did you first become aware of Casa Nova House and its importance to the local area?
Well, I started with Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga in October 2018. And at that time, Casa Nova House had been nominated, I think it was actually nominated back in 2001.
Oh, really?
By a member of the public.
Yeah.
Along with a number of other places that had been nominated. So I was aware that it was one that my predecessor had been working on. So she had already done some research and it had been nominated as a Category 2.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, well, originally, yes, we did. We agreed for it to be listed and nominated for a Category 2.
Yeah. But with further research, I found that actually there was enough evidence to try and pitch it as a Category 1, which means it's got particularly outstanding or special significance, which makes it
of importance to New Zealand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rather than just being to this local area.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
I'm going to go with that because it sounds so much better.
Yeah. The other thing too was at that point in time, it wasn't on the district plan.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think we're probably going to talk about that in more detail later.
Yeah, no, we'll absolutely get to that. But the district plan is, and I think I've mentioned this before in our earlier episode, is the Waitaki District Council, their district plan is the enforcing arm to ensure that properties like this are protected and maintained.
That's right.
As where Heritage New Zealand is the awarding arm and the one that identifies the significance and the cultural relevance to a property. So if you sort of stretch your mind back a bit, do you remember the first time you came to actual Casa Nova House, the physical building, to see it?
I do, and that was the first time I met you and Brenda.
Oh, so was that coming here was the first time?
That was my first time, yes. And I came with my colleague Andrew.
Andrew Bardsby, yes.
Andrew, and that was the first time I saw it. And my purpose that day, I wasn't the area manager then, I was the listing advisor, so the person who looks after the list for Otago Southland and does the research and writes the reports and basically maintains the list like you would a museum collection, that kind of person. And so I was here to see the building so that I could understand the significance, but also part of the listing is not only to write an early history and an historical narrative of the place, but to write a physical description of the place as it is on the day that you visit. So I was sort of doing a room by room look through and description.
Well, on the day you visited, it wasn't actually that long after we'd purchased the property.
That's right.
So it certainly wasn't looking the way that it's looking now when you drove up today.
I know. Quite different.
Quite different. A lot of people don't realise that actually it was in a certainly wasn't derelict, but it was in an absolute state of disrepair from the fact the grounds were so overgrown and touching the building, the gutterings were falling down, and it was cold.
Yes.
It was really cold. I don't know whether you remember that part, but
I
You know,
do.
we were camped out in thermals constantly.
I remember the room upstairs that didn't have linings.
Yes, that's the McMullen chamber now. Yeah, the
Yes.
unfinished wing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that day, it was really interesting from our point of view too, because we didn't know, you know, yes, it was an old building, but we didn't have any understanding of what we'd purchased in that way.
Yeah.
We just fell in love with the building. There was something about it that we absolutely loved, and we were determined we were going to have it. And it wasn't an easy journey, but we got there in the end. But then for us to find out the actual significance that it had to the local area, that's just like cream on the coffee.
Absolutely.
That was just amazing to find out. And I remember that day, might have been Andrew, that was talking about the sparrow markings that were on the exterior of the building. I didn't know that the actual stone was hand cut by axe.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, well, when you think about, so the building was built in 1861, and if we just go back 3 years, that was when John Turnbull Thompson surveyed what's now Oamaru.
Mm-hmm.
And Casa Nova is actually outside what was the town boundary of Oamaru. So it was deeply in the Wops. There wouldn't have been any roads, hardly any bridges.
No, and I think on that map it's drawn as a square box, is it not? And it just says Casa Nova.
Yes,
So
that's right.
It must have been of significance to even feature as a box on this map of the town,
Yeah.
you know, the town being charted.
Well, look, Mark Noble was a member of what became known as the squattocracy. So these are really rich, kind of public school educated, massive landowners who had huge sheep runs. You know, they had masses of resources. And he clearly had a lot of money behind him, as well as being a career soldier.
That's a good point. So Mark Noble is obviously the original owner of Casa Nova House, but we should talk about what brought him to New Zealand.
Yeah.
And because you did the deep dive history on Mark.
Yeah.
And so what led him to be in New Zealand in the first place?
Well, it appears he arrived in New Zealand in 1860 with the 70th Surrey Regiment, and he was here for the New Zealand Wars.
So he was in the Maori Land Wars.
He was in the Maori Land Wars, yes, and he was in a number of campaigns, you know, which is part of our difficult history that we must acknowledge.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. He's been very, very difficult to track, though, surprisingly, given that he was actually a corporal. There's this wonderful project called Soldiers of Empire, which I referenced in the report, and I got in touch with the lead, the primary investigator of that, and she was unable to find further information about him either. And this is one of the joys and immense frustrations of being a listing advisor, is that, you know, you've got the report needs to provide, it's an historical narrative, not an entire history, right?
Yeah.
And so there's all these rabbit holes you come across that you just love to dive down and investigate a lot more fulsomely, like Mark Noble, for example. I'd love to do more research on him, love to do more research on quarries and quarrying and that sort of stuff. But we're restricted in terms of the amount that we can write for these reports physically, you know, because what we need to do is provide enough historical narrative to be able to, as evidence for the heritage values that we then use to assess the property.
Well, wasn't it, I think, obviously originally, my understanding is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, that Mark Noble based the architecture of the outside of Casa Nova House on the family home, Dannett's Hall in Leicester.
Yes.
And his father was actually the mayor of Leicester at one point in time.
Yes.
And it's also my understanding too that the year that Casa Nova House was built in 1861, the family home in Leicester, Dannett's Hall, was pulled down, demolished.
I know, there's all of these weird temporal coincidences throughout the story of Mark Noble, and, you know, that's one of them. The fact that, and we've got an image of Dannett's Hall, which, you know, you can see the resemblance. It's a Georgian building.
It's that square, boxy kind of look.
Exactly, which is, you know, really archetypal in terms of Georgian style.
Especially when you consider that, you know, 7-8 years later, they're building all these ornate buildings in Oamaru, and the Victorian precinct, you know, Criterion Hotel, which we have an involvement with, you know, has this wonderful Italian architecture about it. Yet Casa Nova House is very square. I wouldn't say it was necessarily ornate of the Victorian time as such. You can see that it's been based upon, I believe, his family home quite clearly from the way that it was designed.
That's right. Yeah, and part of that might be economies as well. I mean, if you, going back to what we were saying before about it being 1861 when this was built, there weren't any established quarries then.
Well, from what we've found as well, Mark Noble was born in 1798 in Frisbee. His father, John Noble, served as the vicar of Frisbee for 40 years and then passed away in 1840. We actually got sent some information, which I'll delve into a little bit later from someone in Europe, that details a little bit more about that family history. While we're just back onto Casa Nova for a little bit and we're talking about the stone and so forth, I think it was your understanding that the stone from Casa Nova House came from, was it 2 quarries here in Oamaru, or more likely the one in near the main part of the Oamaru township?
Oh, look, I think we had a quote from a book that sort of talked about kakanui or tōtara, but I'm really not convinced by that. Given that there were...
well, if it was kakanui, that the transportation alone
I know, and that's
would
what
have been
I'm thinking.
a big issue.
You would be having to cross rivers. There were no bridges. There were no roads. You'd be using horses and drays. I mean, we know Mark was a horseman and he bred Clydesdales. But whether or not he was set up like that in 1861, I'm not sure. He only arrived the year before. Yeah, so, you've got to kind of think about the logistics here, unless he had lots of staff on hand. I mean, given that he was also in the war, he can't have actually been here himself for a lot of the time.
He'd got a lot done.
He got a lot done, and he was very young. It was like, did he have clones? I don't know.
No, exactly. And you're right. He was actually very young.
Yeah.
The stone, these are big blocks of stone. These aren't small little, like you'd consider like a house brick size.
You wouldn't be quarrying them as house brick size,
no.
Let alone the size that they are here in the building. You'd be quarrying much bigger blocks. And just to get back to what you said about sparrow pecking before, so that's a masonry term. Andrew said to me, because I gave him a call just to double check, some terms, and he said, oh, that's a term that I'm familiar with from Australia, but it's also known as pecking, or if you're talking about the stone having had a particular, you could call it pecked stone. And the reason why it has these markings, and it literally looks like a bird's been pecking at it. So, it's you can imagine that. And that's just done with a small masonry chisel. The reason why they did it was to provide a surface to lock in lime plaster to have a plastered effect on the wall. So if you think about sticking a key in a lock, you can imagine smushing some plaster across something. Those little peck holes will lock in the plaster to stop it sliding down the wall.
So it gives it something to grip to in effect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you can see that on a one building in particular in Oamaru. I think it's where they sell the moki jackets.
Oh, is that the, oh gosh, I know the building you're talking about at the end of Harbour Street on the left-hand side.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes, so that's got a really rusticated surface. That means that if there was going to be a sort of a lime mortar plaster on the outside of the building, it would stick on there and it wouldn't just sort of slide off if it was an ashlar surface, which is a very flat surface. So what's interesting about Casa Nova is when you look around the building, the exterior, you can see that there's a couple of blocks here and there that have got pecking, and there are blocks that are bolstered, so they've got a kind of a rough, rocky looking look on them. And I think there are some also that are, there's some others that are ashlar.
It's a real eclectic mix, Casa Nova.
It is.
You don't just look at one section of it and think, okay, there's the pattern, and we're just going to... The front definitely has, distinct architecture as far as what's over the windows. There's raised stone that comes out and looks a little bit more ornate, if you could say that, perhaps. If you walk around the actual building itself, there is no real rhyme or reason to it. It's almost like maybe they had a few beers that day and they were just like, let's just whack up this little bit of marking. But it works.
Yes.
The whole thing of it works. And it's interesting from what I have managed to find, and certainly from reading all your literature as well, Casa Nova House wasn't just the stone building that was plocked in a paddock, even though it kind of was, but it also had something like 7 outbuildings behind it. This was a working property. It had to pay for itself in that way. We know that he bred Clydesdales. Are we aware would have more than likely at the time been running vast volumes of sheep and things like that as well? I'm assuming?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yep.
Loads and loads and loads of sheep. And he not only had this land here, but he also ended up buying land out in Kakanui as well. And
wasn't it 1,000 acres or some huge volume of land?
Yeah, masses. And there's a report of him when he ended up selling up. The newspapers are just so fantastic. Check out Papers Past, everyone, because it's just such a wealth of information. There's detailed description of the house and contents when he put it up for lease.
Yes, actually, I have a copy of that article.
And also when he was selling his Kakanui land and his stock as well. There's detailed account of the amount of land and the amount of stock that he was selling. And he eventually even sold Champion, his beloved stud Clydesdale.
Yes. Because I've got a wicked sense of humour. We named the dining room downstairs the Champion dining room.
Yeah.
So we actually did name every room in the house in Casa Nova after someone that had significance to the property. But it's interesting you mentioned about that article, and I have a copy of it here. It says to let for 18 months from March 1st, 1865, Casa Nova. Near Oamaru, the property of Mark Noble, Esquire, consisting of a substantial 2-storey stone house, furnished, containing on the ground floor drawing room, dining room, hall, kitchen, larder, and bedroom. On the first floor, there are 5 bedrooms and dressing room, also a bathroom. And then he goes on to say there's also a detached wash house, wooden stables for 8 horses, coach house, together with 100 acres of land, which about 5 acres to lawn and vegetable gardens, 2 paddocks of 10 acres each in permanent English pasture, and 15 acres in crop. It also goes on to say there's a permanent supply of water in the 2 paddocks, also an excellent stock paddock of 60 acres, well watered and sheltered. For further particulars, apply in person or by letter to Mr. Noble, Casa Nova, Oamaru. Now, that was dated, that article appeared on the 1st of March. And so we know that Mark Noble passed away, Malta, in 1868 at the age of 32. But he obviously had plans to return to Casa Nova. It was not his intention to leave here permanently. But I understand he left. Was it his regiment, or do we know why he left?
Well, it seems that the 70th Surrey moved around a bit, and clearly he hadn't been discharged, and this was something that, I haven't been able to find his discharge papers, and he wasn't a deserter either. The Soldiers of Empire research project that I mentioned earlier, there was a student who was specifically looking at deserters, and Mark Noble didn't come up there. There hasn't been record of his discharge, so that suggests that he was still an enrolled member of the 70th.
So, it makes perfect sense. You've got to, even if you can't find it necessarily in historic literature, it makes sense that you use a little bit of what would have made sense and it was practical at the time. So it makes sense that he would have had to have left. It could have been also that he may have left because his father passed away. So there could have been that reason to draw him back overseas. But clearly he intended to return, otherwise he wouldn't have been looking to lease it. And at the time it says he was looking for a lease of 18 months. So he was intending to return back to, I think, his beloved Casa Nova. Another interesting thing to take on this is why the name Casa Nova. Obviously, when we were looking at buying it, there'd been things online that, Casa Nova as far as the gigolo. Maybe that would have made for a far better story than it's actually just means new home in Italian.
Yes.
But it all leads into the majesty of the story, because I've heard all sorts of things, how there would have been, rope marks from the male servants coming up to the female servants. And honestly, I'm not sure I believe that in any way, shape or form, because the reality is the male servants would have been in the back of those outhouses out the back.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't have been in the main house. This house wasn't as big like an upstairs, downstairs situation in the UK as such. But I do think it's interesting that he had an affinity with Italy. His wife died very young. Do we know much about her?
They married very young. He was a student at both Oxford and Cambridge. He was entered into the Inns of Court, so he trained in law. He managed to pack an enormous amount into a very short life. She died at the age of 20. The place that they went to in Italy was apparently a bit of a go-to
A famous spa town.
A famous spa town.
Yeah.
So, you think about Bath in England. It was a place where people would go to take the waters.
So you've got to wonder if maybe there was something a little bit wrong
I don't know.
health-wise.
Well, I don't know.
I mean, she was
Who
young.
knows?
Her name was Elizabeth Martha, and she
Yes.
actually did die in 1854 at the age of 20, you're quite right.
Yeah.
And she did die in Italy
Mm.
and is buried in Italy. But you're right, she went to, I can't pronounce it, I'm going to butcher it if I try, but they did go to a famous spa town in the Victorian era. There is speculation that she may have been on her honeymoon when she passed away because she was so young. So I'm just reading through some papers that I have here as well.
Yeah.
I mean, somewhere between the grey and the white is going to be the truth there somewhere.
That's right.
It says in here, if this is to be believed, that sort of 14 years later when he did die, he was asked to be buried next to his wife in the same cemetery. And he was initially buried in Malta, but was exhumed a few days later, likely after the execution of his will, and later sent to the spa town to be next to his wife.
And I would love to see the reference for that. I can't remember. I have read his probate, but I can't remember if that was in there or not. That's from the person from Malaga, isn't it, that sent you that info?
Yeah, absolutely. And the spa town at Bagini di Lucha, I'm probably butchering it terribly. So I apologize.
Bagni de Lucha.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
All these hidden talents, Sarah. Impressive. This person that sent me some information actually sent me a picture of the tombstone.
Yes.
It's interesting that it makes sense that he would have been exhumed depending on, his will and
Yes.
what his final requests were.
Yeah.
But
So-
it is a beautiful and it's a sad story.
It is. It is sad. It is sad. Yes. And I think, as titillating as it is to think that there might be some lascivious connection between, the name Casa Nova
The gigolo.
and, the Italian librarian, as I like to call him. Little known fact, he was a librarian.
You got to watch those librarians, obviously.
I know. I think the fact that this would have been the only house in the area sort of is quite, I don't know, there's some gravitas about the name.
Absolutely. And I think too for, what a love story in a way. He's obviously has lost his wife at the age of 20. He's gone on, he's fought in the Maryland Wars and he's built this incredibly impressive property, which is an homage to his family home, his ancestral home. I mean, he could have picked all sorts of different architectural styles. He'd obviously been in Italy. He was well-travelled.
Yes.
So he was well-versed in the way of different cultures, different architectural styles, but yet he chose to base his home where he intended to probably live out the rest of his life.
That's right.
Based something similar off his own family home.
We don't have any record or mention of him having any relationships here in New Zealand. And interesting that he's built this house, which, had a good number of rooms in it.
Well, I think he obviously didn't. Well, he obviously would have hoped that he wouldn't have been single for the rest of his life. He was still quite a young man.
True. That's very true.
But he didn't build a small. You're quite right, though. He didn't build a small little bachelor pad. He built a home that would have been suitable at the time for someone of his stature.
Exactly.
To be able to entertain and to host people. The only thing he was missing really was a wife to be able to fulfill that role.
That's right.
It's interesting. We talk about the architecture, and I brought this up a lot, that the architects of Casa Nova House were Grenfell and Glass. Do you know much about their history and their background? Are they based out of Dunedin, or where did they come from?
No, well, they both immigrated from Scotland and arrived early in Dunedin. Okay, so Glass came here from Alloa in Scotland. He arrived in about 1860, and he was trading as an architect, a builder, and a stonemason. So
He was a jack of all trades, this guy. Yeah.
and people tended to be back in those days. I mean, there weren't necessarily schools of architecture or schools of engineering.
Well, look at the
back then.
craftsmanship. This building is still here.
Yes, that's right. They would be multi-skilled and be able to turn their hands to all sorts of things. So, and he was, what other buildings did he do? The Oamaru Cool Store, which is a listed place, a hospital, and he was known for lots of additions to different buildings and hotels and things in Oamaru.
Which would have made sense if he's come from a place like Scotland where, they're used to dealing with older buildings, where New Zealand was still very much a young country at that stage.
That's right. And I guess that's something to know too for you and your listeners is that, you might have someone who's the architect of a building, but buildings, as long as they continue to exist, will continue to be updated and changed. And that initial architect isn't necessarily going to be the same as, the subsequent architect who might put on an addition or do some changes to the building. So there's sort of they all become part of the story. So clearly Glass was involved in making additions, designing additions to buildings that other architects had designed initially.
Well, what's interesting too is that, yes, the house was built in 1861 and Burns was the builder.
Yeah.
Do we know much about Burns?
Oh,
The actual builder? I named the upstairs room, actually. One of the rooms, the drawing rooms, is named after Burns.
Yeah, no, sorry, I don't know about Burns, but there's another rabbit hole we can go down.
Oh, look, you could spend eternity trying to figure all this stuff out. Being built in 1861, they actually added the extension on in 1900. I'm fascinated by this extension because the house was already substantial. Now, the only thing that I've thought about this quite logically is we just talked about Mark was a bachelor. He was a widower. Sorry, he wasn't a bachelor, he was a widower. But when he's died and his estate still held the property for another 10 or so years, but then it did go on to be a succession of family homes. So it does make me wonder around the 1900, whereby I think at that time, was it Boughton that was that had the property at that stage? And Boughton was a part of Boughton McMaster, the farming dynasty,
yes,
which was huge in the South Island. We're talking huge volumes of money. So it makes me wonder if the house was expanded upon then because it was a family home. Well, it was his city home, wasn't it? His townhouse.
Yes.
We should be clear about this. This was his little batch at Oamaru. And so it did make me wonder because I've often thought, why on earth would you make this bigger? Because it was already substantial. But then it occurred to me, well, because the house changed. It started to become family homes. So what they've done is they added quite a substantial extension onto the back of the house and they moved the staircase. So the internal, when we were doing the restorations of Casa Nova House, we lifted up all the carpet.
Yeah.
And you can actually see in the foyer when you come up the stairs now where the original staircase would have come up and looped round. So what they've done is they've added the extension, they've moved the staircase to the back in that extension to make the upstairs area bigger, and then they've put I believe would have been a kitchen at the back in that extension, which later became a garage and then was turned into a storage area and laundry area for the commercial kitchen. And above it is actually our bedroom now, but at that time it was more than likely servants' quarters or something along those lines.
And that sounds really likely and plausible. That's the sort of functionality that you'd see at the rear of a house.
Well, it's, the servants didn't come through the front.
That's right. Yes, back door.
The back door.
Yeah.
And the other thing that was interesting is when we were rearranging things as far as, pulling down old jib and stuff like that and putting new jib up and running new cabling, it was interesting that we came across the old call system. There was, unfortunately, the wires had been removed, and I would have... I'm actually going to tell you a funny story, which I'm gutted about because I spent 2 days with a builder on this and it cost us an arm and a leg for nothing. But when we were downstairs, there is a doorbell downstairs, an old pull doorbell, which is actually to the side of the house. So when it was built in 1861, that side would have been, I believe, not necessarily a servant entrance, but a delivery entrance. Any guest would have gone through to the front door and been greeted through the front by the servants. But this had a pull, and it still pulls. I sillily saw a bell above the door and thought, well, it must be connected to that. So it turns out it wasn't connected to that. It would have been connected originally to an old call system that probably went towards the back of the house, wherever the kitchen or the servants' quarters were, for them to know where to run to. But can I tell you how much time we spent reconnecting these two areas together that were probably never connected, but now are?
Oh,
so
tell me.
Oh my God, 2 days with the builder. We had to cut into the jib. And run, because I'm all big about future-proofing. So I ran stainless steel cable so that it would future-proof it.
Oh, my goodness.
And then we got to it and realised, oh, my God, it was never connected to that bell. Someone down the line has put a decorative bell above the door. So it was, Go figure. As a part of, our quest to try and put things back, also I made some costly mistakes.
Yeah.
But it does work, and it is now connected to that bell under the door.
Right.
I don't think it ever was originally, but it is now.
Yep.
So those sort of stories all add to the tapestry of it all. We did come across that old call system. Believe it or not, it was on the exterior wall in what is now the Borton Chamber, which previously was an upstairs kitchen, which we sat in and had a cup of tea
Yes,
in, actually, when you guys first came here. And when we pulled off the wall that had the faulty shower, the waterfall shower, we were able to see, you could see the old marks going down the stone.
Right.
But unfortunately, the cabling in that had obviously been long gone
and
long pulled out, which was such a shame. I'd love to have found that and restored that. I don't know who would have answered my calls as I rang them, because it wouldn't have been Brenda. She would have just phoned me and said, get it yourself. But I absolutely would have been sitting there ringing it. I would have had a field day with that. Yeah. And it's lucky because there's houses in Oamaru that do still have those original systems in place. I think Pennyburn might be one of them.
Yes.
But I would have loved to have still had that element here at Casa Nova. We're talking about, Borton and McMaster, the farming dynasty, and this was considered his sort of townhouse as such. There have been a lot of owners of Casa Nova. There's some properties around Oamaru where there's only been 3 or 4, and they've been very lucky because all their original architecture and everything has stayed intact. With us, we didn't have that. There's a series of owners that could total 15, 20 owners. When we took on this property and really did understand its significance and its heritage value, we were very clear that we were just the caretakers. We've always known that. That's our role in this.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll leave it. I think we've left it better than we absolutely found it. But I also think we've now left a legacy for Oamaru by listing it and protecting it for the future. So one of the things I did want to touch on with you is why we should list properties like this and why people shouldn't be scared to list it. From my point of view, I was a little bit scared, thinking, oh my God, what does this mean? Can we not do the renovations? What position does this put us in? Because we were very clear in buying Casa Nova, we needed it to be a working entity. It needed to generate an income. We didn't, unfortunately, have a money tree out the back. There wasn't an endless supply. So we needed to know that we could make an income from it and that it could fund itself. I didn't even need to make a great income. It just needed to fund itself, and we would be very happy with that. It didn't bother us if we had to go out and get jobs to do that. That was not at all. In an ideal scenario, wouldn't you just love it to be your home? But we knew straight away that, from the very beginning, we couldn't afford that. We needed it to be operating, and that's why the decision was made to put in the luxury bed and breakfast, to put 3 rooms upstairs, and to resurrect the downstairs restaurant. So from your point of view, what are the biggest concerns that you sort of encounter from owners like myself when you're first making that approach and you're talking to people? What do you think their concerns are?
They think we won't let you do anything.
Which is a fair comment,
yeah,
a belief perhaps.
Look, I think people watch a lot of awesome British TV shows where
their grading system is really stringent.
Well, it's really different to us too.
Yeah.
It's really different to us too. And I think people relax once they talk to us and they hear that listing is about information recognition. In itself, it doesn't provide protection. Protection comes through the district plan.
Yeah.
Okay. We want to list buildings that are of heritage value. So there's lots of different heritage values, and we've got this amazing resource on our website, www.heritage.org.nz, called Significance Guidelines. And that goes into great detail about the heritage values and what they are and what they're not. And that's kind of the listing advisor's Bible when we're assessing a property. When someone nominates a place, they need to let us know why they think why it should be nominated. We're looking for places that have a real story. Just having architectural significance, one value can be enough. There needs to be, substance and information and evidence to back that all up.
Well, and I suppose with Casa Nova,
there's a lot of that.
Yeah, there definitely was.
There was a lot of evidence.
But with Casa Nova, there was lots of firsts around it. The first stone dwelling.
Yes.
And my understanding too is why we ended up with when we agreed to voluntarily list it. And I sat down with yourself and Heritage New Zealand, and we sat down with council, and we talked about it. I had no issue in listing this property, especially after the homestead, finding out that that was going to be demolished, and that was the first property we looked at. I had no issue in us listing that. All I needed to know was that we could do our renovations.
Yes.
And that we could continue to do that, and that we could turn this into a commercially viable operation for us.
Yeah, definitely.
And our fears were put to rest as far as that was concerned. But we were also very upfront with Heritage New Zealand, and showing them, right, this is our plans, this is what we're thinking.
And that's great. That's the great way to start the relationship. So when we know that a place is, say it's a place that's already listed, or like in your case, it was in our
it was on your radar.
It was on our radar. Like we knew, it was sort of in our process, in the beginning stages of our process. So we know that there are heritage values. For our heritage places to continue to exist into the future and to continue to be part of our built heritage and our history and part of our communities, we need them to be lived in and loved and used. And using these places means that we need to be able and open to adapting them.
Yeah.
We don't expect people to live in museums. We don't expect people to live in unhealthy environments. This is why we provide assistance to private owners through incentive funding, which it's called the National Heritage Preservation Incentive Fund, which Heritage New Zealand administers.
Which we applied for and unfortunately didn't get.
You can always reapply. You can always reapply for future things that you might need to do.
We've still got 2 walls to do, so I may do that just yet. You never know.
Actually, the fund opens at the end of this month.
Oh, does it?
Yeah, so it's open annually from April into June.
Something that I was just talking about actually in my last episode was the fact that we had applied for the fund, but you can't have already done the works, and that's something that you've got to be very clear about for someone that is applying.
Yes.
Which is why we chose to hold off on the exterior works, but we continued on with the interior works.
Yeah.
But from our point of view, we were very lucky that we didn't alter any stonework. So that's another thing to point out too. So what we were doing, we removed a bookcase that was a doorway, and you can see the doorway.
Yes.
So we didn't alter any stonework. We did have to make penetrations through the stone to put in sewer and to put in things like that, the infrastructural stuff, but we didn't change any of the original floor plan. So we were lucky that we had a floor plan that suited our purpose of what we were wanting to do with the building.
Yes, that's right. But even if you didn't, it's all about having a conversation with us and being able to discuss, well, what are your plans and how's this going to work, and is this going to affect the heritage fabric, and what are the payoffs?
And I think that's scary for people because when you're Category 1 listed, that you're whenever you do any works or alterations to the property, you're actually meant to apply through council. Is it for a resource consent?
That's right.
Yeah, you have to apply through council for a resource consent. But I know, for example, in the Waitaki district, there is conversation underway that the category listed buildings, that they would consider waiving those costs to be able to. You still have to apply because everyone wants to know what you're up to, and it does need to have checks and balances to make sure that you're not getting carried away with what you're planning.
Well, that's right, and it's so that you can get best practice advice and that sort of thing as well.
Well, I mean, as I talk about in earlier episodes, and the thing with Casa Nova, the original Victorian, there was no original Victorian sort of cornices or anything left upstairs or downstairs. They had been pulled out because the house was derelict by the late 50s, early 60s. I mean, it would have been demolished had the Graham's family actually not bought it and renovated it. And they took out a stone wall downstairs, which is now the part of the main dining room, which I believe it was the stone wall from a dining room to a smoker's room is what I understood it to be from descendants of the Graham family. And they seem to recall that it had like 4 fireplaces in it. It was absolutely bizarre. But I'd love to see the original floor plan. That would be my dream if that turned up somewhere.
That would be amazing, wouldn't it?
Oh my God, I'd love to see how it was originally sort of laid out. I mean, because we haven't altered any stone, we know roughly the rough layout. I know now where the staircase came up, but I'd love to know how that downstairs worked. I think that would be amazing to sort of see. I quite fancy, maybe I should get myself a smoking jacket. Lord knows I was skinnier when I smoked, that's for sure. But now that we're all so much healthier.
Yeah.
But, getting back to the people's wariness about listing properties, I think it is really important to keep an open dialogue and be transparent.
Yes.
I mean, I don't think anyone is there, and this is maybe the misconception that Heritage New Zealand is there to make your life harder. It's not.
Oh, no.
It's there to provide, I think, the expertise and guidance that you would not necessarily have in dealing with a property like this. We didn't go into this understanding about stone markings on stone or limestone mortar, or there's parts of Casa Nova that many years ago they'd put in cement into the when they've repointed, and they shouldn't have. It should have gone back to a limestone mortar base.
Yeah, that's right.
And that would have been lack of awareness and probably cost.
Yes.
Cost cheaper.
Yep, that's right. That's right. And you're lucky that Andrew, who was working with us at the time, he is our Built Heritage Conservation Advisor. Before he had that role, he was a stonemason. He really knew stone and he knew mortar. And he had the, expertise and knowledge to be able to explain that and understand how, and be able to describe to you, how a Oamaru stone building actually works and functions.
And that we shouldn't seal them. They need to breathe.
Yes, that's right.
So I was saying there's only one room in this house that was sealed, and that's the one in the Borton chamber, the exterior wall, because you don't necessarily want dust falling on your head if your bed's underneath it. But all the exterior walls, none of that's been sealed. It's all been kept original so that it can breathe. We're very lucky in a town like Oamaru to have significant trades that have an understanding of how to deal with these types of buildings. We have great stonemasons. We have incredible plasterers. I can't name of anywhere else where we would have had the same level of expertise to draw upon, a condensed per population, than probably we've got right here.
Yeah.
I mean, when I think about it, as far as, especially to do with all the plasterwork, the gentleman that did our plasterwork for us and hung the cornices and everything, he actually attended his first ball here when he was 16.
Really?
So he would be, gosh, he's going to kill me if he's not as old as this, but he would be in his mid-70s to 80s now. And at that point, we're retiring. I'm sure that this project would be towards the end of his last lot of projects. So it's amazing to think that he worked on this house and also attended his first ball at that age. It's harder to find people that like him that could actually handcraft the mouldings.
That's right.
So where there was,
Although there's Seddons and Dunedin.
Yeah, but that's actually where we got the mouldings from, actually.
Oh, right. Yeah.
But he can, actually go up on a ladder and actually hand mould it to match.
Amazing.
That level of skill is just incredible. So I think we're very fortunate in this town to have right the way through, from builders that know how to work with properties and double sash windows and how they work, and to be mindful of the trims and the dealing with it. Even the builders we used, we were so fortunate that they were patient and tolerant enough with me to router out the shape of the stone so that I could expose the stone in each bedroom.
Yeah.
I still believe it's really important that part of the draw of staying in a property like this is that you get to see those original hand axe marks and you get to feel a part of the history, because New Zealand's young. It's a young country in comparison to Europe. We don't have a lot of historical references, maybe, that in comparison to other countries.
In terms of our colonial heritage, certainly.
100% from that point of view.
Yeah.
So I think when you can sort of stay in a building that's, 163 years old, that doesn't come up every single day of the week.
It doesn't. Yeah, you're quite right.
So from Heritage New Zealand's point of view, I know that when we unveiled our Heritage New Zealand Category 1 plaque in around the December of 2021, which we were very excited to get, and we were very fortunate to have some guests from Heritage New Zealand there.
Yes.
And I think if going back from my recollection, they were very impressed with what had been done here.
Yes, they were.
And was that from the point of view of how you can restore a property to be commercially viable and yet stay within its parameters?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, also, a large part, well, it's now a large part of the history of this building is hospitality. Mm-hmm. So it's over 60 years, I think.
Yes,
I
100%.
did a rough count up, where this has been a place of restaurants, catering,
social
accommodation, social gatherings, receptions, invigorated two aspects of the building. You've invigorated and restored the heritage fabric, and you've also restored what really now is an integral part of the social function of the place as well.
Well, going back to the 60s, after it was derelict, it reopened in 1969 with the Grahams family, and they opened it back up for social gatherings and events. So this did form the backdrop in the Oamaru community for, a number of weddings, 21st. It had a role to play within the community that was greater than itself.
That's right, yes. And so I think this is where we're looking at, because heritage isn't just old. Heritage is, can be within people's lifetimes as well, or, your parents' lifetimes. Like the man that you mentioned who came to help with the ceilings.
Yeah.
The fact that he had his formal hair.
And remembered it fondly.
Yes, well, that's right. And, for someone to be able to come into a building and have personal memories, these people in the community are connected to this place. And that's what our heritage
That's a very good point, because there is a connection here.
Yes.
Even Fleur, in her book, references Casa Nova House. She actually signed us a copy and gave us a copy, where she would run down the hill and old Mrs. McMullen would give her barley water. And so it's that you don't realise sometimes the connection that a property can have and the people within that property with the greater community.
Yeah.
Because it fell off the radar for so long, for the 25 years, it wasn't in anyone's radar.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, in a way, it's kind of been forgotten. So I feel like the publicity that we've had around Casa Nova House and what we've done, I think has also helped to jog it in people's memories. And it's interesting. I'm going to bring up the McMullen family, because they were the longest family to actually reside in Casa Nova House. And there's still family descendants in McMullens here now in Oamaru, and a lot have been to see us and have come through and had a look at what we've done. And we named the unfinished wing after the McMullen family. They were here for 30-something years. Very interesting story. She had married a gold miner, James, and he'd had a heart attack so died. And she was left raising all the kids. There was 8 or 9 kids, and there was no money. So there would have been an element to this that would have been an incredible property to live in, but also very daunting not having the funds to be able to do anything with it.
Yes.
So that's when the land started to get sold off. By the 50s, the last 20 acres had gone. Incredible story of so many different. You've got 8 or 9 kids in a house. They all go off. They get married. They have children. That tree is getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
And the impact is getting bigger. So I think it's very interesting where you've got you've got people like Borton, who was a part of the farming dynasty, that this was his townhouse as such, very wealthy. Then you've got the McMullen family that didn't necessarily have this sort of wealth and money, but certainly did in love and family. Then you've got periods of dereliction when then the house was it was going to be demolished.
Weren't there sheep living in
There
here
were,
at some point?
Apparently. Everyone thinks it's a ghost house. If I make no money out of it, you watch the space. We'll rebrand it as the Ghost House of Oamaru. No, I'm kidding. It's the energy that's in the house is very good. You can feel it. It feels...
I remember you telling me that when I first came to visit. Yes.
It's a funny story. I'm not sure if I've said it in the podcast, but I was here before we'd actually bought it. I was meeting tradesmen to see, to start to get an idea of costs and what it might look like. And I was in the upstairs drawing room, and it was daft o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, and the house was freezing. The layers of thermals, the coats, the beanies, the whole thing was on because it was so cold. And I was looking out the window watching the sunrise, and I actually felt like I'd been hugged. It was the strangest. I'll never forget it. And later on down the line, having spoken to the Grahams family, I kind of feel like it was Mrs. Graham. So, and I'll tell you why. So when the house was derelict in the 60s, she found out it was going to be demolished. And that was it. The house was going. She thought it was an absolute tragedy. So she talked her husband into buying it because from what I could gather, he loved her so much. He did whatever she wanted to do.
Good man.
Good man.
Good man.
Smart man. So they bought this house and they turned it into the first kind of incarnation that we see for it being a social gathering and events. So they knew at the time too that you couldn't afford to just have a property like this without it turning some type of income. So upstairs, they lived obviously upstairs. I believe that when she passed away, her body did rest in the house for a period of time. But there's a real connection with her family and still to this property. Their daughter, Heather, is still our neighbour to this day, and we have a fabulous relationship.
Great.
And she owns still the last 7 acres behind us, which I'm looking through the office window now at, which was the original orchard to the property. So dearly, like one day we'd love to get that back into the fold without question. But it's also very interesting to know that from what the kids say, she just absolutely loved this property. And it wasn't necessarily something that they could probably afford at the time, but they, her husband was really clever. So he was able to do a lot of repairs and restorations at the time. And in the 60s, people weren't thinking about saving heritage in the same way.
That's right.
That we are now. So, architecturally, we probably lost a lot of buildings, and we start to see the Art Deco, Art Nouveau come through, and that's definitely in our cornice work. You can see it. Things were getting pulled down because Victorian wasn't hip. That seemed old-fashioned.
Yeah.
When they were going through and restoring it, I understand that, I was talking to Stuart Graham, and he remembers as a kid being up painting the roof. Christ, can you imagine in today's day and age with our occupational health and safety, what would have happened if we'd put a 12-year-old or something on the roof up there to paint it?
I know.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
But, they've got real connections with what they did. They know how things look to a certain degree and what they did to it. One of the rooms is actually named after him, the Graham Chamber, because of the role that they played.
Yeah.
He also put on the front balcony. We obviously restored it and made it safe again because it had been sitting there for a really long time. They took down a wall downstairs in the dining room to make that bigger.
Yeah.
So their impact upon the property, I think, is almost as significant, if not more so, than the McMullins or the Bortons or the other people, because they stopped it from being demolished.
Yes.
So we wouldn't have this legacy now had Mrs. Graham not had the foresight to say, no. We need to protect this. We need to buy it, but let's be smart about it. What can we do with it? And so this was a love affair for her, for this property, absolutely. And the kids have all been through it. And the night we opened up the restaurant, they actually came and all had dinner, and Stuart got his bagpipes out. And they played the bagpipes, and he came up the stairs and played the bagpipes upstairs for his mum.
How amazing.
It actually almost brings a tear to my eye thinking about it. So when you talk about the significance, cultural significance from a heritage element, it had so many ties to so many people in so many significant ways, this property, because it did have a lot of people that lived in it. Yeah. And the whole north end of Oamaru was referred to as Casa Nova at one point in time. Unfortunately, now there's only a park, but there did used to be a school.
Yes.
And named after
a kindergarten or
and so I believe it got amalgamated and joined into one combined school. So there's definitely that historic role to play that doesn't necessarily just mean an old building. It's that historic role that it played in the community.
Yes, definitely.
And I think even not going back more than 25 years ago when it was a fine dining restaurant, people had another round of memories that were created here.
Yes, because that's a special occasion place to come.
And I think even today, people still see Casa Nova House as a special occasion venue. And I suppose because it's not every day that you get to experience something like this. As time goes on, I mean, even now, I don't take for granted where I live. And, I feel really lucky. I said to Brenda the other day, I was walking around the outside and looking at the grounds. I feel blessed that this is where we get to call home. I might whinge sometimes about the cost of it all, but I think everyone would. But I do feel really blessed that we have formed the tapestry of the property going forward, and I feel like we have to help to protect this.
Oh, undoubtedly. I think you're both pretty imbued in the building now.
We did name one wing after us.
Oh, did you?
Yes, with the Laverick McLaren wing. That's our bedroom. So I figured while we were naming rooms after everyone, we should at least name one after ourselves.
Why not?
So from your point of view for heritage going forward, I think it's really important for buildings like this. There needs to be, unless you can afford to maintain them independently as a private citizen, I do think we need to look at how we can commercialise buildings to keep them relevant.
Yeah.
And not just relevant, how can they make money, but relevant in the psyche of your community.
Yes.
So from those aspects, from what you're saying, Heritage New Zealand is definitely open to having those conversations with people. If someone's out there thinking they've got a building that's of significance and they're tossing and turning, should we do this?
Absolutely. We'll talk to everybody, anybody. We want to have, if people are thinking about buying a heritage building, we would encourage them to talk to us. We often, when heritage buildings come up for sale, people call us to do due diligence. That's a good time to talk about plans. Once you've bought your building, talk to us. We can help you, discuss your plans, help you, help connect you with people in the community that are in trades. We work together with councils as well. If a place is listed and it's on the district plan, then we're what's known as an affected party when people go for resource consent.
Mm-hmm.
That just means that if you haven't already contacted us, then council would let us know, and we'd be able to have some input at that point. But all the advice that we give is free. We don't charge for anything. And in fact, if you're a private owner, you can apply to our fund for incentive funding, which means up to 50%. Yeah, but we have a good relationship with our councils. We're really excited to hear about what people want to do with their heritage buildings. We see our role as helping people to make the best decisions, to maintain heritage values, and to ensure that, they're making good economic choices that are going to help maintain and look after their buildings into the future.
Like going forward, do you think people maybe should not be afraid and just make the phone call?
Yeah, don't be scared.
Don't be scared by it.
Don't be scared. Just get in touch with us. Just get in touch.
From our point of view, in the end, what is protected in this building is the windows, the doors, the internal staircase, the fireplace, the marble fireplace from 1861. These elements are protected because they are still original to the building. A lot of what we had on the inside was no longer original to the building, except for it's stone, obviously, things like that. It's not necessarily doom and gloomy that people think it is.
No,
I think
that's
it's
right.
Conversations.
Yes.
And
you need to sort of look at things not only from where Heritage New Zealand is, but also what district you're in and what your district plan says, because, that's going to vary depending on where you're living in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And so if your building is scheduled on the district plan, and Casa Nova wasn't scheduled at the time, was it? No, it's in the draft plan. It's in the draft plan.
Yeah.
So, actually,
I think it had been earmarked that you guys were,
Yes.
you knew it was of significance, maybe not to what degree, but there was a conversation around the fact that, it would be great to protect this building.
District councils can independently schedule items to put on their schedule of, heritage
Without
places
the
and
owner's
structures.
consent as such. Or,
Well, some do. I think most prefer to have.
but they do have the autonomy
owners.
that they could actually do that.
They do.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can't speak for Waitaki Council, but so they can have their own list or their schedule of places that are acknowledged and protected, and then their rules around heritage are what is applied to that. So, and that can vary from council to council. When Heritage New Zealand lists a place, because we've got our own act, the Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga Act 2014. In our act, it says that district councils need to have regard to the list. And that means that they need to pay attention to what's on the list, and ideally we would like them to add listed places to their schedule of heritage sites in order to protect them. And actually it's a good thing because we do the heritage assessment. It means that council doesn't need to.
No, you've actually done all the groundwork for it.
Yeah, well, that's right. And so that's sort of a win for councils. It means that, they don't need to, their staff don't need to, redo that assessment because it's already been done.
And people can find the listing for Casa Nova House on Heritage New Zealand's website.
Yes, on Rārangi Kōrero, the New Zealand Heritage List. Yeah.
Going through that process too, just wondering what are the different levels of Heritage New Zealand listing? We know we went for Category 2, but we're Category 1.
Yeah.
So we know what Category 1 is, but what are the other levels of listing?
Yeah, so we have historic places, Category 1 and Category 2. There are also historic areas. So in Oamaru, there's 2 historic areas. There's the Oamaru Historic Township, and there's also the historic port. Now, within an historic area, that's a sort of a demarcated geographic area which needs to have at least one historic place within it.
Oh gosh, we've got like a plethora of them.
Tell me about it, because I'm soon going to tell you about another kind of listing. There's also wahi tapu and wahi tupuna places and areas. So they are places of particular significance to Māori that might be, spiritual or have some connection with ancestors and
And that's
cultural
the
landscapes.
indigenous culture and race of New Zealand, just for our international listeners.
Oh, yes,
Yep.
yes. For example, there are historic places, but also wahi tupuna places in Waitaki around rock art sites. We also have, like, the uber top of the list is the National Historic Landmark. So currently there is one that is listed, and that is the Waitangi Treaty Grounds. And there is another that is very near the end of its process, which is Pouhere, the National War Memorial.
Oh, I didn't realise that. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And we are looking at part of my job at the moment is to progress one for Oamaru
Which is where?
in the historic area.
Really?
Yes.
Would that be where the Criterion sits?
Oh, maybe. Yes.
So
So we'll be having future conversations about that.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
So for listeners, so they understand, and I will get into this in a later podcast. But we also took on another historic building in Oamaru called the Criterion Hotel, which was built in 1877. That we're trading as a working restaurant there, and we've put a lot of funds into putting a big commercial kitchen there and so forth. So when you're talking about that area of Oamaru, what sort of listing type is that? That would be
A National Historic Landmark.
wow.
It will be the first in the South Island.
Wow, I had not even heard whispers of this. This is incredible. Are our listeners hearing about this first? She's looking at me now like, oh, have I said too much? But look, I understand why it would be. For people that don't understand, the Criterion Hotel is on the corner of Tyne and Harbour Streets. Harbour Street is the most intact Victorian streetscape in the whole of New Zealand.
It's pretty amazing.
It is incredible. So I could understand why that would be deemed of such significance. As you may be aware, Sarah, I'm a big advocate at the moment for that being pedestrianised through there. From the fact that, at the time when these areas were built, people didn't have the invention of electric cars and things like that. So I think now, because it does have such a high influx of people walking through there as tourists to take advantage of the fabulous buildings and the scenery, that you don't necessarily hear vehicles. I think it's now an issue of safety and so forth as well. These sorts of areas need to be enjoyed and experienced to be understood.
They do.
And for that to happen, you need to create places and spaces for the public to want to enjoy. I'm excited about that. So when do you think you might know more about that? When will that be sort of?
It's an ongoing project at the moment.
Yeah.
Yes.
Also, so people know, the Whitestone Civic Trust owns 16 buildings down in that area, which is a charitable trust. They're actually our landlord down there for the Criterion Hotel. And they do a remarkable job because it's not, there's not a huge amount of funding out there, and they are a charitable trust. For what they do, they have someone full-time on their payroll who does an incredible job of going around and maintaining the buildings. There's a lot of work.
Yep, they're great, and it's all feeling very positive.
Gosh, that's exciting. So would that make it only how many of those types of locations in New Zealand would that bring it to?
3, and there is another one that's being worked on at the moment as well. There were only 6 that were proposed back in 2014.
So this has been going on for a while.
Yeah. Well, when our new legislation came through, that was when the National Historic Landmark was put in, and was added into our legislation as work that we need to do is Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga. They're quite big projects. Oamaru, being historic areas, is quite different from a historic place. Yeah, there's more moving parts.
That's exciting. I think that's really exciting for Oamaru and how we progress forward. There's such a big element to tourism here for, the role that it plays from its Victorian era. And we're just a part of that chapter as well, with little old Casa Nova House in the North End.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it's just been such an extraordinary commitment for a generation now of Oamaruvians living and working in that historic area, and, creating or maintaining these buildings and creating new businesses and this little tourist mecca.
And the huge amount of the volunteers.
Yes.
I've never come across a town like it, where it has so many people willing to give up their time and energy for the community betterment. I think that's a testament to where we live and why people want to live here.
Yeah.
So, well done, Oamaru. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Great stuff. Look, Sarah, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. We've both had a journey on Casa Nova House. And I think it's great that we can sit here today and be recording this from inside Casa Nova House and what we've done and what we've managed to achieve even jointly, and protecting it going forward. You've got these great locations everywhere in Oamaru and great buildings, and it's fabulous to be able to open them up and let people enjoy them and see them. And that's the other great thing about Casa Nova to a certain degree, is that for 20 years it was kind of predominantly closed up. It had little openings here and there, but it's good to know that people can share in the journey with you. They can come and stay here. The rates that they're paying is going back into preserving this building.
That's right.
This is not just a case of, someone making an income off this.
Yep.
This is the case of every penny you spend with us is actually going back into helping keep this building maintained.
Yes.
Because I was pointing out to you today when we were coming up the stairs, we've done the renovations on the inside, and bugger me, we're now back to the maintenance of it.
Yep.
So it is an actual journey. It doesn't really ever end.
No, it doesn't. And because you're a listed place, your relationship with us doesn't end either.
No.
We're here for the long haul. Our the ability to pick up the phone and talk to us or send us an email or ask a question or apply for funding, that doesn't stop.
No, and that's appreciated because, sometimes you can feel like you've been left to the wolves when you do something like this. But in our case, we certainly didn't feel that. We felt like we've had good support from Heritage New Zealand. We've had, really good support from the Waitaki District Council. So the parts that needed to be involved in this have really stepped up for us. We were granted $20,000 from the local Waitaki Heritage Fund.
Brilliant.
Which, really... But at the time, I tell you, it was really well received because that was around the time we were finding out that our loans to refurbish had been dropped by 100,000. In fact, we went into the first Christmas thinking that we weren't even going to have the refurbishment loan. So it's been such a journey for us to get to this point. Not an easy one, but one that I don't regret in any way, shape or form. But I want to thank you very much today, Sarah, for taking the time to come and chat with us.
You're welcome.
And I know that we will continue to have an ongoing heritage relationship. But for people that are interested in knowing more, please go to the Heritage New Zealand website. Very easy to find online. There's lots of information. And as Sarah said, they're just a phone call away if you do have any questions. Thank you very much. You've been listening to the Last Resort podcast with your host, Katrina McLaren. To see Casa Nova House, go to our website, www.casanovahouse.co.nz, or check us out on Facebook or Instagram. You've been listening to the Last Resort podcast with Katrina McLaren.